You're just listening in, some commotion, and you could only imagine, picture the spectacle, the mayhem that would have ensued if Diddy did walk through those doors as a free man today, if bail was approved, but it was denied. Let's continue our conversation. Bring in another legal expert, legal analyst, Tre Lovell. Tre, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. As we're learning bail denied, he'll have to await sentencing in the MDC. What do we make of this decision pertinent to bail?
That's a surprise. Because you need to remember that the charges of which he was convicted, prostitution, it's a nonviolent crime, it's a consensual crime, and typically not deserving of something that should be without bail. Also, when you're looking to consider bail, you look at, is he a flight risk? Well, they can do things to ensure that he's not a flight risk, take his passport, restrict his travel. And plus, why would he do that? Why would he leave his family? And why not, stay at this point and fight this, at the appellate level? And it's surprising because I thought, after the long trial and after, we got the criminal convictions that we did, that the judge would let him out. So it's a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, and he ruled, the judge did, based on some of the violent past, and we saw some of it with our own eyes in terms of that Cassie Ventura video. How much do you think that weighed? Do you think that was the biggest factor for the judge on why the bail was ultimately denied?
I do think that was the biggest factor. He did mention the fact that the defense conceded that Combs was violent, and they certainly couldn't deny it based on the video. So I think that was probably a main factor in it. But as I said, what's the motivation for Combs once he's out on bail to either, commit another crime, to commit another assault, to be dangerous? His bail would get revoked. Those actions would go into consideration of sentencing. He'd get a worse sentence. So there's really no motivation on behalf of Diddy to be violent to anybody, a threat to anybody, or to run away, to flee. So it kind of goes against both the motivations of what Diddy you would expect him to act, as well as kind of, based on the actual crimes that he was convicted of.
And let's move forward to what comes next, because the sentencing date not officially set. We saw October the 3rd being thrown out. The defense wants it a little bit earlier. What type of arguments will be made in terms of that, in terms of when the sentencing actually happens?
Well, they're going to want the sentencing to happen as soon as they can, so that way they can get, onward to the appeal and start fighting from that perspective. And I think that they just want, the time to start, because they know he is going to get some jail time. But in terms of what's going to go into the sentencing, listen, he's a first-time offender. It's a maximum of 10 years. He's likely to get kind of the lower end, possibly consecutive. We're not sure. So it's a big question whether or not the judge is going to throw the book at him on this or not.
Does that give you any indication, based on the fact that they denied bail, that the sentence might be longer than anticipated?
It could be. I mean, that gives me the understanding that the judge is thinking, hey, listen, he's going to be serving time anyway. Sure. So, why let him out on bail for a small period of time and then just put him right back in? So that also, I think, went into consideration. But, it's going to be hard because the judge sat through the whole trial. And the judge heard all the evidence. Now he needs to limit the sentencing to the actual convictions. Despite what the government had charged. But, it's tough to read the tea leaves on this. Sometimes judges want to overcompensate because, if the prosecution didn't get the bigger charge, maybe they'll try to be heavier on the lower charges. But, this judge seems to be a straight shooter. And I would just presume that, it being his first offense, he may get the lighter side of it.
That is very interesting. And of course, he has been fair, very balanced, and really more so eager to be balanced, to really seeing how high profile this case was. Let's come back to the bail part a little bit, because you mentioned the flight risk as the prosecutors were concerned about that. The judge also potentially concerned about that. We were hearing from our Fox 5 team in New York, was listening into them, and they were talking about how the presence of his family might indicate that he wasn't a flight risk, just having so much support behind him. Can you talk about that factor, having his mother there, some of his children present at the case that has gone on for 2 months? Did that help him in any way?
I think it should have. I think for all indications, there's not much evidence that he's a flight risk. And remember, when this issue came up before, it was that, they were worried about whether he's going to threaten witnesses, tamper with witnesses, affect evidence. So they wanted to keep him in. They restricted bail at that time. Well, here we don't have any of those factors. We don't need to worry about witnesses in terms of trying to tamper with them. We've already got the conviction. So, him being a flight risk, I think that's a tough argument to make because you're right. His family's there. He's going to want to stay with his family. They can make a bond package, that can meet the expectations of the court. Say, hey, Your Honor, this is the bond we'll put up. We'll take away his passport. We'll restrict his travel. We'll have somebody monitor him if the court wants. They can do a number of things that can meet the expectations of the court and alleviate the court's concerns about him being a flight risk. So I'm a little surprised, why the court wouldn't indulge any of that.
Yeah,
I understand that they're concerned about the safety, of Cassie and some of the other witnesses. But as I said, what's the motivation for Diddy to do that? He's just going to get his bail revoked. He's going to get a longer sentence, and it's not going to do him any good in the long run.
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, the defense already has his passport, so it's not like he's going to be able to go outside of the country. We covered really everything that's happened in the last 20 minutes, half an hour, and that's been all some of the breaking news. Let's take me back, though, to early this morning, because yesterday we saw the partial verdict come down. The judge, the prosecution, the defense, all on the same page to say, hey, jury, go back to the deliberations to resume more. They came back pretty early in the day with a split verdict. Were we surprised that overnight, sleeping on it, didn't change any of their minds, or that deliberations didn't continue on longer into the day?
I wasn't really surprised. They seemed to be pretty ironclad in those 4 counts. And I felt they would come back and they wouldn't try to revisit those. They would try to, figure out that 5th count. And I figured it would happen that day because there's enough hours in the day where they should be able to decide that. So I wasn't too surprised. What was interesting, though, is, when we heard that there was a unanimous decision on 4 counts, including the sex trafficking, that would lead you to believe those are probably convictions. Because now they're just trying to decide whether or not to go up another rung on the ladder, and reach the RICO. But to find out that they had acquitted him on those and were still considering RICO is pretty interesting. But other than that, yeah, I kind of felt they would all wrap up today.
And just speaking to that, because we've talked to different experts about racketeering, about RICO being so very hard to prove, especially when you're talking about an individual, and RICO wasn't necessarily made for a case like this. Did the prosecutors, did the federal government go too far in trying to tag on RICO with Diddy?
I think they did. I think they definitely overcharged this case. First of all, when you're going to go racketeering, it's 2 or more people conspiring, to have an enterprise to commit crimes. Well, where's the other person? He was the only person charged. Plus, this is emanating from 2 private personal relationships, one a 10-year relationship, the other a 3-year relationship. And to try to build a RICO case, a sex trafficking case around relationships where the evidence shows that they loved Diddy, that they were excited to be around him, and they stayed. To try to then, build, this racketeering around this bedroom lifestyle, this exotic lifestyle, I thought was a pretty big reach.
Yeah.
And also, when they first, indicted him, I thought there was just going to be a plethora of victims. He's got 60 plus civil lawsuits out there, which means there's 60 plus victims. I would assume we would had a lineup of victims, for this case to really prove up the racketeering and the sex trafficking. We saw 2. So it didn't really meet expectations as the case went along.
Do you think they should have brought forward more people? Because I think there was maybe trying to find a balance between going all in on all of these witnesses and finding some of the key witnesses. Do you think they should have brought forward more potential victims?
I think they do. I think the most effective victims the most effective witnesses and evidence would have been the victim, because they're going to be the subject of the sex trafficking. They're going to lead to the predicate crimes. They're going to help establish the RICO. And to have some victims that weren't his girlfriends. You need some type of distance. Because sex trafficking. We think of this hostile efforts to abduct women, force them into sexual servitude. You know, we don't think of it with girlfriends. So if they could have found any victims that weren't necessarily girlfriends, but were part of this type of exotic lifestyle, I think it would have helped. And I have no doubt they tried. I mean, I don't see why the government wouldn't be trying to get as many witnesses as possible. And at that point, then going down the list. But it was a surprise, and I definitely think it was overcharged. This was a state case. This
Yeah,
is a
that's what.
domestic abuse, assault, rape. This is not a racketeering case.
Yeah, that's what one of the legal experts also said, that this should have been a few blocks away there in New York. And it was also interesting, some of the witnesses, they also had to sign agreements that they wouldn't be prosecuted for some of these crimes to even take the stand. Tre, anything else that we're missing? Anything else you want to note before I let you go?
Not really. It's going to be interesting to see what the ultimate sentence is going to be, whether or not the judge really throws the book at him. And certainly, what's going to follow up with these civil lawsuits, because he's not done. He's got to deal with these civil lawsuits, even though it's not about crimes and about his liberty, it is about money. And that's going to be a whole different fight.
All right, very good. Tre, thank you so much for breaking it all down. It is kind of over, but it is not, as sentencing coming up here in just a little bit. Thanks again. I appreciate your time here on Live Now.
Thanks for having me.